So welcome to St. John's College. Is this here? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So welcome to St. John's College. I'm Henry Yu. I'm the principal here as well as one of the organizers of the conference. So this is the keynote section for a two-day conference. So for those who have not picked up the program yet, tomorrow we have a full day of forum panels and workshops to discuss some of the themes that actually will be raised today. And so I'd like to thank the other fellow organizers who put together the panels for tomorrow. Dr. Leo Shin, my colleague here at UBC. Leo, wave your hand. Dr. Helen Leong over there. Dr. Hedy Law over here. So they've put together three, as you can see in the program, for tomorrow, which should be really exciting. Today, I'll introduce my fellow keynote speaker, but first of all, I just wanted to give you a little background about where you are and what the conference is about. We are at St. John's College. We are also on the unceded territory of the Musqueam and Coast Salish peoples at UBC. So St. John's is a graduate college that's an international graduate college with 165 students, many of whom, 80% from around the world, from 45 different countries. And so it's a really, I think, apt place to have this kind of conference where we're talking about things that really are a global phenomenon. But I think the other reason why it's apt is that St. John's was founded 17 years ago by the alumni of St. John's University of Shanghai, many of whom were you could say very worldly because it was an English language university in China. It really was one of the elite universities of China where many people who went on to become important translators of literature, translators literally of important conversations. So for instance, recently one of the Johanngians, Lu Ping, who many of you may know, was one of the negotiators for the reversion of Hong Kong from British to Chinese control. He recently passed away. He was a Johanngian. So a very interesting place with interesting founders for this conversation. So the conversation actually is part of a 5-year project called Hong Kong Canada Cross Currents. The partners are UBC, Simon Fraser University, the University of Toronto's Hong Kong Canada Library, Richard C. Lee Hong Kong Canada Library, as well as other partners as well within a number of projects. And the main aim of the project overall is to research and raise awareness about the last 50 years of migrations back and forth, literally, the cross currents of movements of people, of ideas, of goods between Canada and Hong Kong. And so it's in some sense to get away from perspectives that only see people in one place, but to actually follow the people and as they move about. And as we know, many of us who are connected to the history of Hong Kong migrations to places like Canada, often these are not just one-way movements, but multiple movements, different movements in different directions at different times of people's lives, children moving separately sometimes from parents. And so it's a very complicated set of migrations that we're looking at. This two-day conference is actually a chance to start talking about some themes which, as you will see in the next little bit, we're going to raise some questions and issues both today and then tomorrow going into more depth, which hopefully will allow us to have some themes and questions that will be shaping our work over the next few years. So anyways, I will move on to introducing the keynote speaker. So I'm one of them, but the other one who I think is more interesting is Ms. Zoe Lam, who is a PhD candidate in linguistics at UBC. But I think why I find her work, and many of us find her work, so interesting is that she really is raising issues and questions about Cantonese language and culture that perhaps have not been raised in an academic setting. Much of the interest in Cantonese is often one that has to do with identity, has to do with politics, and yet in some ways it isn't studied in the same way that, say, other languages are. And so I think one of the things that we really find exciting of having Zoe here as a PhD candidate. She also lives here in St. John's College, so even more convenient. And she will also be our lead researcher at UBC here as part of the Hong Kong-Canada Cross Currents project over the next year in terms of looking into and leading a team of students and looking at various aspects of research questions around the Cantonese worlds. And so I'm going to introduce also a film. So we're going to start with a film. And the film was made by an undergraduate who is a recent graduate at UBC from Sauder Business School, but she took a minor in the new Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program, which I'm very proud to have been a part of, helping build. The director, Christopher Lee of English, will flit in and out here, I'm sure, at some point. But she made a film as a student about Cantonese. She herself is someone who grew up here but spoke a lot of Cantonese. Her family was a migrant family who came from Hong Kong. And so it's an exploration in some sense of the passing on of Cantonese. So we thought it would be a wonderful way to sort of set the conversation off first. So this is film.
That's kind of expected though, right? If you move to a Western country, regardless of how hard you try to speak Cantonese and keep it in your family, eventually it's going to just go out from your, because you're not going to speak to your kids in Cantonese if you are raised in that group, right? It's eventually going to happen.
It is not an exaggeration to say that Cantonese may disappear in 50 years' time. It is not an exaggeration because if we look at the history of Hong Kong, Hong Kong used to be Hakka dominated many years ago, but because there were a lot of people from the Canton province, the British government actually encouraged the use of Cantonese so that these people can communicate with each other. So within 2 generations' time, Hakka became a minority language.
It's a fading language because I guess the province, like the Canton province or Guangdong province, I went back about 6 months ago and there's already a lot more speakers than there is Cantonese. And kids at school are learning Mandarin, and historically it would be a Cantonese kind of province. And so far, where I've really heard more Cantonese is in Hong Kong, and even in Hong Kong, there's been a lot more Mandarin speakers. So that's kind of like the last city where Cantonese is kind of the main language. In terms of Vancouver, I think another generation in Cantonese is going to be pretty iffy. So yeah, I have kids. Chances are that they're not going to be that great. It's important to retain some sort of language skill, and it's part of our culture. But I'm not gonna like pressure them into speaking. Yeah. But if they wanted to go into business, I think Mandarin's more important.
There has been a sort of built-in bias against Cantonese as a regional language, or maybe you can even call it a dialect. Somehow the general impression is that it's secondary to something. Secondary to mainstream Chinese culture, secondary to Mandarin, but that's obviously false.
I think for a lot of the young people who live here, they're just like, well, if it's not relevant to me, I'm not going to use it. So how can we help our young people in the next generations hold on to a language that they feel is important to them?
有啲係父母用廣東話同佢講，佢用英文答你啊咁咯。咁所以咧，有啲學得多啲，有啲咧到家都仲係學得唔係好唔係講得好流利，同埋我哋講啲特別嘅語言啊，嗰啲嘅 term 嗰啲啊，佢唔明白，所以佢嘅表達咧，有時我哋聽得唔好清楚，唔明白。我哋講嘅嘢咧，佢有好多時都唔係好明白，要指手畫腳咁話俾佢聽，舉例佢先明白你講乜嘢。
佢想講，你知道佢想講，唯有幫佢就講一句英文啦，然後再解釋佢聽。
我好少會怕醜就唔講，因為我覺得如果同我講緊嗰個人係淨係識廣東話啦，咁佢會 appreciate at least 我係試下係咯。所以如果我有個口音，如果我唔會 completely 即係溝通啦，佢都係 it's effective enough。不過我覺得如果我講緊我細佬咧，佢就可能如果人哋唔識，完全唔識講英文，同埋佢唔識咧，咁佢就會 completely not even try。
你可以話俾佢聽，你呢個世界唔使怕人㗎，你自己講咧，你中意就講出嚟，佢聽到就聽，聽唔到就算數。
係咪？同埋龍榮。
呢個加2蚊用
唔緊要啦。
幾叻，
用啲乜嘢？
梗係識睇啦。
I think one of the challenges as a young person, from my personal perspective, is that a lot of the Chinese schools that I went to when I was a kid, I hated it. It was so boring. I got straight A's, but I only memorized it so that I could not get in trouble. I didn't memorize it because it was interesting.
When I was in elementary school, I took Chinese school from grade 4 to around grade 7 or 8. It was terrible. I was terrible at Chinese. Except actually, like, since then, I was able to go back to Hong Kong and China quite often, and it's been really beneficial for work.
我覺得有幫助。如果我哋屋企人翻香港，我都會識communicate。因為如果我完全唔識講廣東話，咁我完全唔可以同人哋溝通啦。
I work in commercial real estate, and sometimes, I think it was last week, we had a Cantonese-speaking family that wanted to open a restaurant in Surrey, and normally our company only speaks in English, but since I was able to communicate, that was a lot better. They were asking like, oh, where are your parents from, where are your grandparents from, and one of them is from like the same village like my grandma's from. They'll speak a little bit of that dialect, which is like, I guess, Chuzhou. So it's like, I think right away they have something to connect with, rather than, you know, you're from Canada, they're from China.
I have just uttered a sentence that makes perfect sense in Cantonese.
Cantonese is such a poetic language, and it can capture so much in just 4 words.
Cantonese is special because it has a grammatical category called sentence final particles. And these particles reflect the speaker's attitude about the proposition in a sentence.
我可以舉個例啫嚇，譬如話你生咗個仔啊，如果佢係覺得嗰個仔咧好緊要咁，啊仔啊咁係嘛？如果佢生個女佢唔喜歡女咋咁就唔同啦。佢話個仔好啦，即係矜貴個仔噃咁。如果佢生個女佢唔喜歡女咋咁。啊呢啲都係廣東話表達嘅一種嘅意思係嘛？譬如話你好叻咁啊，好叻咁啊，即係正面啊！你好叻咩？咁嗰個咩字即係話你係唔係好叻啊？你好叻咩？咁最尾嗰個字咧係影響整個嘅意思唔一樣。
I know that Chinese language has hundreds of dialects. And there's a lot of dialects that are becoming endangered. And I think Cantonese, although people never expected it to be, can move along that track.
At this point, we can still do something. We can still push the government to encourage the use of Cantonese. We can still encourage our friends who speak Cantonese to speak Cantonese to their children. And this situation is reversible if we do something now.
And I hope that people get inspired by the beauty of Cantonese and all the other dialects and want to step up and do something about it, because it's going to take a lot of people to figure out creative ways to make it happen.
we're going to be watching a lot of film clips actually in the next couple hours. If you want, we're going to email this or put it up online on the conference website. We can also email them to you so that you can easily link to them. And so don't worry about trying to write down the URLs and the intricate code of the URLs. But I'm going to pass it on to actually, and what we're going to be fairly informal with this keynote and do it kind of as a back and forth. So Zoe, and I were going to just cut each other off and and do things like that. So we don't have to agree. I think that's part of it. But Zoe, please welcome Zoe Lam.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad a lot of people came today. So, as you know, this conference is called Cantonese Worlds, and if you look at the translation of this title, it's called Tong Yan Sai Gai. So, it's like the world of the Tang people. So, what is Tang? Tang is actually a dynasty in Chinese history. So, when Cantonese-speaking people refer to their own community, they often call themselves Tong Yan. And this is an interesting question, and this is the first interesting question. And the second interesting question is, why is world plural? So if we look at the title again, it's Cantonese Worlds. So why do we have more than one? And in this talk, we will address these questions. And in the title, we can see the past, present, and future of Cantonese language and culture. So maybe a lot of us will have the question, why do you call Cantonese a language instead of a dialect? And I'll also address this question in the talk. So as I've mentioned, Cantonese-speaking people often refer to themselves as Tong Yan. And this can be shown in this gate of Chinatown in Montreal. So it reads Tong Yan Gai, so the street of the town people. And this has to do with the history of the Cantonese language. And when we think about China, we think about this territory, this shape. But this is the territory of this country today. So we have to bear in mind that actually this boundary moves in history. So sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's bigger. So we have to remember this first. And then I'll talk about why linguists call Cantonese a language. So from the linguistic point of view, all languages are languages and dialects are also languages in a general sense. So it's not the case that if something is called a dialect, that it is not a language. And language and dialect are defined differently from the political and linguistic point of view. And there is no right or wrong. It's just a matter of how you look at this issue. So if we look at the definition of language and dialect from the political point of view, then it's very simple. So one country, one language. So like Spanish is spoken in Spain, and then Portuguese is spoken in Portugal. So that's a very straightforward definition. And then the non-official languages are called dialects. So people do this for different reasons. For example, they hope to achieve unity within the country. But for linguists, we define it in a different way. So we look at this factor called mutual intelligibility. So if we have two varieties of language, like language A and language B, so we have one speaker from language A who is monolingual, meaning this person only knows how to speak language A, and another monolingual person who can only speak language B. So if we put them together and ask them to chat, if they can understand each other, then that means these two languages are highly mutually intelligible. So if they are highly mutually intelligible, then they are closer to the dialect end. So a language and dialect is more like a continuum. It's not like either language or dialect. It can be a continuum. So if I put a monolingual speaker of language C and a monolingual speaker of language D together, and they cannot talk to each other, they cannot understand each other at all, then that means these two languages are mutually unintelligible. Then in that sense, we'll call them languages instead of dialects. So actually, if we look at this diagram, it's called the map for Sinitic languages. So actually, China is a very big country, and there are several language families within this mass of land, land mass. And for example, we see Hakka, Min, Wu, Gan, Xiang, and Cantonese belongs to the Yue group. And these are all different languages, meaning they are mutually unintelligible. And when we use the word Cantonese in English, this word is quite ambiguous. So Cantonese can refer to the Yue group in general, and it can also refer to the specific varieties spoken in Guangzhou or Hong Kong. So I think in this conference, we'll use it in a general sense. Languages in the Yue family, language family. So now we know we're focusing on this pink part of this map. And as I mentioned before, the territory boundary may change. So if we look at the definition of dialect or language from the political point of view, then the same language can be defined differently depending on the political status of the region. But according to the linguistic point of view, whether two languages are dialects or languages, this status will not change no matter how you redraw the boundary of the political entity. So we need to bear this in mind. And then now we are going back to the question, why do Cantonese-speaking people call themselves Tongyan? And this is a timeline of Cantonese. It's quite complicated, but the main point is here. So this is the Tang Dynasty, which is around 618 to 908 Common Era. And as we can see, at that time, the variety of Chinese spoken is called the Middle Chinese language. And in the Tang Dynasty, there were a lot of wars and social turmoil. So a lot of people migrated to the south. So actually the capital at that time was Chang'an, and it's present-day Xi'an. So that was the capital. And people living in this region called themselves people from the Central Plains, or in Cantonese, Zhongyu. So when the war happened, people moved to the south. So back then, this area, present-day Canton province, was called Lingnam. So a lot of people migrated to the south. And that's why Middle Yue preserved a lot of characteristics of Middle Chinese. So from this quote, which is a thesis from University of Texas at Austin, so this quote goes, in fact, no other Chinese dialects could have preserved so perfectly the complete tonal system of Middle Chinese as Cantonese did. So remember, when linguists say this, it doesn't mean we say that Cantonese is better. No, because all languages are equal linguistically. So this is only a description of the phonological characteristic of Cantonese. So it has preserved the tonal structure of Middle Chinese. That's why you hear people say that when you read poems from Tang or Song Dynasty, it actually rhymes better in some poems when you read it aloud in Cantonese. And that applies to Hakka and Min languages as well. So we can see, if you look at the color, after Song Dynasty, the Yue language has not changed that much since then. There were no systematic changes in the sound system. So that's the history of Cantonese. And that's why, even today, the pressure to be identified as people from the Central Plains is reflected linguistically in the fact that some Yue speakers call themselves Tang people of Tang culture and language. So that's why we call ourselves Tongyan. And if we zoom in into that little pink zone earlier, we see that even within the Yue family, there are different branches. So for the varieties spoken in Guangzhou and Hong Kong, it's actually the Guangfu Pin, so this color. And there are a lot of other varieties in this family as well, like Taishanhua and Zhongshanhua and Donggunhua. So they all belong to the Yue family. And these are also very important communities when we talk about migration. So migration is a big theme when we talk about Cantonese language and culture. Why are we talking about migrations? When we think about Cantonese, we always think maybe the culture capital of Cantonese is Hong Kong. But actually, Hong Kong, I mean, a lot of years ago, Cantonese was not the dominant language there. So the British people arrived around this time, and we all know that Hong Kong used to be a village for fishermen. And have we ever thought about what language they were speaking? So actually, a lot of people back then spoke Hakka, and a language called Wai Tao Wa, which literally means the language spoken in the walled villages. And how come Hong Kong became a Cantonese-speaking region? It's because of migration from the Canton province. So there was migration during this time, and during the Civil War, and during the Cultural Revolution. And that's why Hong Kong became a Cantonese dominant region. And apart from migration to Hong Kong, of course, there's also migration to Southeast Asia, which happened really long ago, that it's not shown on this timeline. It's way before that. And there's also migration to North America. And it also happened really early in the 19th century. And this is a world map showing some of the migrations. But actually, there should be a lot more arrows than this. And Henry can talk about migration.
So maybe I'll come in with the history part. So one of the things that's really crucial to think about, actually, in terms of the effect of migration on language, is that these were highly circular or circulatory migrations, which meant that people went out and back at different times of their lives, beginning really in the 1500s, so the 16th century, in large numbers. It was always actually those kind of circulations between what was the Empire of China and regions outside, so especially to the south. So what we think of now as Vietnam, in fact, has at different times in its history been kingdoms inside as well as territories, or territories inside as well as kingdoms outside of Imperial China. So just to give you an example, around 1000 BCE, Vietnam becomes, quote, independent. And what that means is it becomes a tributary kingdom. But a lot of the people are the same, and there's these continuing circulations between what is southern China and places like what is now Saigon or Hoi An and Hanoi. So when we think of migration and language, one of the crucial things to think about is actually how there can be a conservative effect on language because people are circulating between multiple sites. Linguistic change in one spot can have a lot of rapidity over time because an isolated population, everybody starts to speak differently, well, everybody in that community starts to speak differently. But if you have multi-sited areas where the same set of people keep moving around, it's actually a highly conservative factor. So one of the ways to think about migration and language is to think about how people constantly moving between 5, 6, 7 spots. There is actually a positive force for speaking the same way in all those spots, if that makes sense. Okay, so maybe switch there. Just to give you a couple examples of two regional languages, or languages that are spoken in these regions, Hokkien or Minnan and Cantonese. They both, for 500 years, were dominant migratory languages, which meant that people left villages in the south coast of China, and they went out into Nanyang or the South Seas, and they would have highly circular networks of trade. This is just a couple of the trade routes that people moving out of Guangdong as well as Fujian province went and came back. And both those, not surprisingly, languages are fairly conservative in terms of how much they changed over time. There are other actually languages, Jiuzhou and and Hakka, which were also part of these regional trade networks and migration networks. They tended to name the worlds that they went into. So in the 19th century, they started, especially the Cantonese, to go into new areas that were British colonial holdings and territories. And so they went predominantly to Australia, New Zealand, well, it was in the United States, Canada, Hawaii, some areas of the Caribbean, through the port of Hong Kong. And one of the really important things to think about in the 19th century is that Cantonese speakers dominated the Trans-Pacific. And so there was a Cantonese Pacific that arose. Hokkien speakers and other dialects or other languages did not go across the Pacific. This is a map of New Zealand during the sort of gold rushes to the Otago fields. It's a map of the Cantonese names for places in New Zealand. So literally they had, names in Cantonese. They had an imaginary map, you could say, of this world. And the term that they gave in Cantonese, Gamsan, to all of those places, sort of is a way of understanding that this is a set of worlds that they're moving around in. Next. Just to give you figures for Canada, this shows just in 1910 to 1923 the origin places in those 13 years of all the migrants who were coming to Canada who paid the head tax. We had very good records. If you have eagle eyes, you'll be able to see the numbers, but basically what it shows is those 7, or 8 counties, 4 counties, 3 counties, so Samyup, Siyup, as well as Zhongshan, they account for 99.9% of all the migrants. In other words, nobody except Cantonese are moving into these places. Next one. This is maybe easier to read. This is for the whole period 1858 to 1949 that we have figures for. Again, these are the counties. You can see which ones sent the most. 45% came from Toisan or Taisan. More than half came from the 4 counties, Siyup. Less than 0.01% came from Fujian province. This shows just where they were going. So again, these worlds were spread across the Pacific, these Cantonese worlds. So across the places like the Malay Peninsula, Indonesia, and in what we now call Southeast Asia, but also across every small town in Canada. So these were Cantonese worlds. The dominant language would have been county or local dialects or languages that were Cantonese languages. Just to give you a sense of why people are going out, this is an atypical and yet typical story. This is a story that comes from Walton Look Lai's work about a man who went first to California during the gold rush. Right? Then he moves on, comes to Canada, helps build the CPR, keeps going, goes to Guyana, then to Trinidad, eventually becomes fairly successful in Trinidad, opening a bunch of stores. Right? Has a wife in Trinidad, has a wife back in home village, retires, goes back to Hong Kong with his youngest son and sort of living a life of luxury. Now, this was atypical. Most young men who went out into these worlds didn't become successful like this. But the story would move around in those same networks. And that story is the Gold Mountain Dream, is the one that young men thinking, I'm going to be just like that. It didn't matter in some sense that 99.9% of the people never made it like this. This story gives you the hope that you're going to be John Lee Lum. Right? And so in some sense, that's what fueled generation after generation after generation of recurring migrations out of the same villages, the same several hundred villages in the same 8 counties that were going out into the world. This is very important to understand because you don't move that far without having an incredibly powerful dream of making it, even if the chances are arrayed against you for ever making it. Most people, most of these young men did not make it rich. But they did create these global networks that stretched across Southeast Asia, across the Pacific. So just as an example, those of you from Shanghai will recognize that as the Wing On department store, the first department store in Shanghai. All 4 of the first department stores in Shanghai were Cantonese, were Zhongshan merchant networks. The capital from those, to fund those department stores, came from market gardens and far-flung capital networks that were across Australia, Hawaii, San Francisco, Victoria. So these were global companies. Let's see. I guess you move to the next.
And I want to add the point that these overseas communities are very interesting because if we look at the timeline, these migrations happened at a different point on the timeline, meaning that these communities conserved the variety of Cantonese spoken at that time. So it's like a living fossil of a kind of Cantonese spoken in the past. For example, in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, I've heard my friends say something like, 你食咗飯冇啊? Instead of 你食咗飯未? So that's the kind of grammar in older Cantonese. So these communities actually play an important role in the conservation of the language. And this part is about culture.
Yeah.
So when we think about Cantonese culture, we can think of the traditional sense, such as Cantonese opera. And actually these overseas communities, after they move to another country, they have a very strong bonding within the community and they conserve the culture very well. And they also have tours around the world even, or around North America, and by doing that, they are conserving the culture as well. And we can also think of TVB. So TVB is the broadcasting company in Hong Kong, and it has produced a lot of popular drama series. And when Hong Kong-raised young people talk to Canadian-raised young people, very often they talk about TVB drama series or pop songs, Cantonese movies, and it's this kind of cultural industry that bonds different Cantonese-speaking regions together. And we can see that from several examples. So the first example is from Malaysia. So I'm going to show you a video in which a singer called Wang Jiming explains why he wants to learn Cantonese, and you can see the influence of TVB. So you can see the power of culture. It can really bring people together, even though they live in different places geographically. And another interesting question is who owns Cantonese? Because Cantonese is not the official language of any country, so we don't have an organization that writes a test for people who learn it as a foreign language. So who actually standardized Cantonese? Although officially there is no such thing as standardized Cantonese, we kind of know what it is when we refer to the Guangzhou variety or the Hong Kong variety of Cantonese. Why did that become standardized Cantonese? It's pretty much because of TVB. Yeah, it's pretty much because it's spoken in drama series and it's sung in pop songs and it's circulated widely in different regions in the world. And here's another example from North America. So you hear a rap song called ABC. So the singer is MC Jin. He was born and raised in New York, and he's a rapper, and he won in a big rapping competition. And he brought this rapping culture back to Hong Kong, and in the debut song, he explains his identity as an American-born Chinese. So ABC means American-born Chinese. So there are no English subtitles, so I'll give a little translation here. So you'll see images of Chinatown, pretty much a Disney-fied Chinatown. And he moves around in Chinatown and explains, oh, I'm just born in America, but I'm ethnic Chinese. I'm not that different from you. I also watch TVB dramas, and I drink Vita Soy, which is a popular soya milk drink. Yeah, so let's listen to this song. Being an American-born Chinese, and he pointed out a number of elements shared by people who grew up in Hong Kong or China and people who grew up in North America. And you can also see this by directional cross-cultural fertilization. So in the past, cultural export was one way. It's just from TVB to the rest of the world. But now with internet and with music industry, we can see North American ethnic Chinese can also bring something back to Hong Kong or China.
And even though we're talking about music and movies over the next couple of days, I mean, you can think of the number of beauty queens that have gone from Vancouver to Hong Kong, the number of Edison Chen, just to mention one sort of movie star. And so the kind of flows back and forth are actually incredibly interesting over the last 2 or 3 decades in particular. But you could also argue that it's been like that for hundreds of years, that in fact those are the kinds of flows that we often miss historically because we've been so, I might say, disciplined to see things in national frameworks that we don't see these kinds of complex cross-currents and flows historically. And maybe we're going to play one last video, but I think one of the things about we'll talk a little bit during Q&A about the sense of endangerment of the language, but I think up till now it seems like we're trying to explain why it is that there's been Cantonese worlds for hundreds and hundreds of years, how they in fact have shaped very dispersed spaces. So people moving across the Pacific, across the seas, how there's flows of not just the people, but cultural elements, Cantonese opera, musical forms, Canto pop, movies, TVB, and things like that to go across those far distances. And those will all be picked up as themes, tomorrow. But I think one of the things is, if this is true, then how could it be that this could disappear? Or how could this be endangered? And I think that's one of the things that, again, is one of the questions that we really are trying to raise today, as well as tomorrow, is that if you think about the frame of looking at and listening to these young people, is L1, or your number one, your home language. Right? What's happening is that a home language is generally now incredibly impacted by state policies. And so what is the language you're supposed to learn in school? What is the language that becomes an official state language? What is the language that you're rewarded for speaking, both in terms of doing well in school, but also in terms of getting jobs, business languages, language that can be spoken in large numbers. And so that's one of the things that if you think about people from the ages of 1 to 12 right now, right, that's what is actually a crucial way of thinking about endangerment in language. It's not, there's a lot of people who are 40 years old or 70-year-olds who could speak. What is happening with children from 1 to 12? And if you think about that across Cantonese worlds, so in Guangdong province, in Guangzhou, in Hong Kong, here in Vancouver, in Kuala Lumpur, you could say that perhaps only in places like Kuala Lumpur and Malaysia is Cantonese as an L1, as a home language, still fairly safe, that children from 1 to 12 will still be speaking that regularly. In every one of those other places, state policies to push, say, English as L1 in North America, or Mandarin, or Putonghua as L1 in the People's Republic of China, or in Hong Kong now. And so what you're seeing is a moment where it looks like there's so many speakers, and yet within 1 or 2 generations, if you play out what is happening with 1 to 12-year-olds, a language can disappear, in fact, very quickly. So we just wanted to show this. Those of you who love watching YouTube videos, you'll recognize the Wong Fu sort of group, but I don't know if we probably don't need to. You want to explain this? Yeah. Okay.
So we're going to watch a video, and these people are from California, and they have Cantonese background. So they're going to discuss what it's like to be Cantonese in North America, and they bring up issues that we mentioned earlier, like language endangerment or cultural elements that bring people together, and themes that will be mentioned tomorrow in other panels, such as history, music, and the media.
What's going on, everybody? Today we're at New Lucky Restaurant with a bunch of Cantonese people and Richie Lee, and we're going to talk about being Chinese, but specifically Guangdongyan. We're talking about Cantonese, which is one of the largest subgroups of being Chinese. Wes, you are Cantonese?
I am. Super Cantonese.
Why do people kind of use Cantonese and Mandarin almost as different ethnicities or different cultures?
I think Cantonese and Mandarin are two separate dialects, two different languages actually, because you can't understand the other one. Cantonese has about 8 or 9 tones. Mandarin has like 4, maybe 5.
China is like one big place. There's going to be a lot of differences. If people ask, are you Cantonese or Mandarin? Already there, I'm giving them some points. For someone to know that there's a difference there, that's already pretty cool. Most people say that Cantonese is more harsh.
Or robust.
Or I like that. We are very robust.
They like to joke a lot.
They like comedy?
Yeah, they like comedy. Because you know all the best Chinese comedies are from Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, Jet Li is super serious, and then you look at Jackie Chan. Basically, like, I mean, he's hilarious.
He's a Chan.
He's a Chan.
Definitely Mandarin is more formal. I think Cantonese is more slang. It's more of the, the hipper, cooler language. There's like so many different ways to say one word.
So I am on my way to Hong Kong. Nice dinner, guys, but time to go and hold an umbrella and get some food. So, see ya.
From all ABCs, we said Lei Ho.
I grew up in San Marino, so basically surrounded by Taiwanese friends. I did go to Cantonese school, though, in El Sereno, growing up.
I don't hear about Cantonese school very much. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That exists?
Yeah.
Wes is signing up.
It was nice to go Saturday mornings and be connected with other Cantonese kids.
So I grew up in the Bay Area, and I feel like the Cantonese population up there is pretty strong. Talking about my parents, they're from Guangzhou.
We also call it GZ.
GZ.
That's the nickname.
The same way someone like Mandarin goes to like Taiwan and they feel a sense of pride, I think, because they can speak the language. When I go back to Hong Kong, I kind of have that feeling too, where I've returned to a home that I've never been a part of.
Man, that's a Wong Fu line, man.
That's the Wong Fu.
Growing up in the LA part of Chinatown, there was also a lot of other ethnic Asians. It was really diverse. I was never really in a setting where I really got to speak it at all, unless I was at home.
I have a question, like, why is your Cantonese easily the best among everyone here, but you say you speak it so little?
I grew up watching a lot of TVB.
That's not the first time I've heard that.
People watch TVB.
They watch the dramas and they get really good.
I remember when I first went to Hong Kong, I thought it was so dope because it was like a really big city full of people that were speaking the same language as in Chinatown. We went to Hong Kong and it was like this futuristic city that was speaking Cantonese.
I actually like because there's both sides. There's some really grungy, dirty parts of Hong Kong.
Yeah, it's almost like post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Some of it's future ghetto.
It's crazy. But then, you'll walk a block and you get the nicest, fanciest shopping center. I kind of like that, duality.
And I think it's funny that we say Cantonese is not the mainstream Chinese, while in America, it's actually the mainstream Chinese, because Cantonese people were the first ones to come to America and establish kind of the Chinese culture. What is the first thing that comes to mind when I say this name? Stephen Chow.
Hilarious.
Kung Fu Hustle. Shout out to Kung Fu Hustle, because actually I learned a decent amount of my Cantonese from that movie, and my dad told me, that is very bad Cantonese.
You knows how to have a good time, and I like how you always have the same team of people. I want to hang out with you.
Just Kung Fu Hustle close, that's all I know. Andy Lau, Lau Da Hua.
Oh, my dream guy.
I know that from the culture that my parents come from, it's a really big deal. I do like some of his movies, but I would just say his pop music that he makes is horrible. It is horrendous.
I think he has some good classic karaoke songs.
Can you say one?
No, because I need to sing along to it.
Oh, okay.
I have a lot of respect for him. I think he's awesome. Internal Affairs, one of my favorites.
He's talented. He can act, he can sing, and literally anything he puts out has become successful. And he never ages. That man still looks the same 20 years ago.
Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, Chow Yun Fat.
I like Bruce Lee because he wasn't just a movie star, he actually created his own craft.
Jeet Kune Do.
And I think it's important to note that I feel like when he came to America and he was representing Chinese, he really knew Chinese culture and he really understood American culture at the same time. He was very philosophical about it. And that's what I try to take from him, is to try to understand the two worlds, the duality. Yeah. I think that's what more and more people should look up to him as. Not just a fighter, not just because he was buff, not just because he could punch you 6 times before you even blink, but because he really understood Chinese culture.
I guess one of the biggest questions the Cantonese people have right now is there any point in learning Cantonese?
I love the Cantonese language because it's so colloquial, but at the same time, there's a lot of phrases that you can say in Cantonese, but you can't write it out. So I think in 100 years it might be phased out. Nobody's going to want to learn it anymore.
I think it's always going to be around, if not in China, at least in a lot of overseas Chinese communities. Every country you go to on earth has a Chinese person, and more likely than not, they're Cantonese.
I'm already having enough trouble just learning Mandarin. To try to learn Cantonese, it's tough. But I do always want to keep it. If I have kids, they are going to know at least the dim sum names.
I just want to preserve what I know and maybe, hopefully pass on to my kids. That would probably fall on, like my mom and dad teaching me.
You lose the language, then what makes the Cantonese Cantonese?
Even if in 150 years, like Cantonese is almost phased out, I hope Cantonese food is not phased out.
Ooh.
That is the best.
I don't know what the future holds. Somebody somewhere will keep it. We could all teach the people watching a Cantonese phrase. Cantonese has 9 tones. All 9 tones is contained in the sentence is all sern sig yup woon ao lam wan tang nin tong.
我想食一碗牛腩雲吞麵湯。
我食一碗牛腩雲吞麵湯。
Oh!
牛腩入汁雲吞麵生。
Yes!
So let's talk about why it's even important to talk about identity at all. So many second generation or third generation kids in America, we're like, oh, we're just American, just be American. Why talk about where your parents came from and all these stereotypes and why these matter? Those have been rooted in our culture for so long. It doesn't just get washed away in one generation in America. Whether or not you like to admit it, it does matter.
Talking about it is the only way we're going to preserve it. Most Asians in California, maybe even America, don't really think about the specifics of their culture. We're not trying to segregate. We're not trying to raise the differences of who's better and who's worse. Just more identify what our roots are. And I think every culture does that at some point. For Cantonese people in America, we got to do that too.
Things like identity, heritage, and where your parents are from, they can be such uncomfortable topics, right? Because you can't control them. We literally at birth have no choice what ecosystem we're born into. Like the Cantonese Chinatown world, that was one of the worlds that I grew up in. We all grew up in. I think it's noteworthy to talk about. Just because you don't talk about it and you try to sweep it underneath the rug does not mean that it goes away.
It's going to grow underneath the rug, and then the rug is going to get really big, and then you're going to look under it one day, and it's going to just blow up in your face, and you're going to wonder what happened.
That's why we're talking about it.
That's why we're talking about it.
That's why we're talking about it, man.
That's why we talk about it. All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining us for our episode about the Chinese Cantonese identity.
Canto Talk at a table. Shout out to everybody.
So that's why we're talking about it.
This is a great summary of the points like migration and culture and the future. Yeah.
So actually, I think that summed it up in many accessible ways. But what we thought we would do is actually open it up for question and answer, and we have some other slides actually too about that are specific to endangerment. And if you want to know about that question, then Zoe, I'm sure, would be happy to go through some of those as well. But we wanted also to have it talk about it. And so yeah, but thanks Zoe for she put together the slideshow, and I think a lot of this is shaped by Zoe, so I wanted to thank Zoe for really getting us started. So please, Alyssa Leong, who was one of the organizers of the conference and did a lot of work along with Denise Fong and Angela He, who couldn't make it today. So she's going to have a microphone. If you could just put up your hand, she'll come over and give you the microphone. We have to use the microphone because, as I said, we are taping this. So if you are a felon or you're being arrested somewhere, if you appear, then you probably don't want to appear on film. But those who don't mind, asking a question, it's being filmed and it'll be on the internet to share with others who couldn't make it today. But yeah, please do talk into the microphone if you have any questions or statements.
Your comments.
Comments.
Or feedback. Or
manifestos.
Things, yeah.
So please.
Anecdotes.
Over here, Helen. So please do introduce yourself as well, so everybody knows who you are.
Hi, my name is Helen Lang. I'm faculty member at SFU. I just want to thank you for the great keynote. I love all the media that you show. So I guess I'll just start off with maybe one question for Zoe. I think, maybe we will go into discussing, how to continue or how to kind of make sure there is a future for Cantonese. And one thing I noticed from some of the videos is that there seems to be a kind of cool factor associated with Cantonese, MC Jin rapping and all the Asian Americans talking about how, Bruce Lee, it's like it's cool. So I'm kind of curious, like from your linguist point of view, how, when you don't have institutional support, which Cantonese kind of is lacking, how would the kind of street cool factor, what can be made of that to kind of to exploit that so that it can kind of contribute to the continuity?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about language vitality, there are several factors. So government is just one factor. So there are factors from people, from bottom up. So like the speaker's attitude, and that would be relevant to the motivation for learning. And the cool factor is a big thing when we think about motivation for learning. And if we remember what was said in the video, they mentioned Bruce Lee or Zhou Renfat or Andy Lau, and they're pretty old, relatively old actors, like in the 40s. And the golden age of Cantonese culture, so the golden age of Cantonese pop culture, a lot of people think it's in the 90s. So that was very cool. And if we want to keep this vibe, we need to produce cool things, new things, because like 50 years later, these actors may pass away, and we need a new generation of cool actors, actresses, singers. So this is definitely important in motivating people to learn Cantonese. Because when I think about my friends who are Canadian-born ethnic Chinese, I ask them, how come you can sing karaoke so well? It's because they're big fans of certain singers, and that's why they could speak or read Chinese very well. So we need to keep making high-quality movies and songs. Yep, and you can disagree with that.
Maybe even though you didn't ask me the question, but I think tomorrow, I'm cool enough. No, I'm also 40-something, and I was thinking, I'm on that downhill slide, go on the other side. But again, Helen's, I know that when we talk tomorrow again, and Helen's panel as well as Hetty's will be taking up some of these issues, because again, I think framed by, in a historical sense, state actors are really powerful in terms of wiping out languages. If you think about France, the classic historical example is France under Napoleon, where Parisian dialect is enforced in schooling across France, and within basically 2 generations, Parisian French becomes the national language, not only officially in terms of by decree, but in practice, because again, those 1 to 12-year-olds right? If that's what you learn in school, it becomes the national language very quickly. All those regional languages, in France, are basically, by the end of the 19th century, disappeared or are only there in remnant traces in what is known as regional accents, right? That you speak Parisian French with an accent. It's because, in fact, you were speaking a different language 3 generations or 2 generations earlier. And so the idea that we're searching because Cantonese has no state behind it, has no schooling except those weekend Cantonese schools, which on the whole have disappeared in North America. In the night there was a master's in language and literature education who completed her work several years ago, Hong Jiang, who basically found that most of the language schools in Vancouver had been teaching Cantonese up until the 1980s, and then the vast majority switched to teaching Mandarin within that decade. And so if you don't even have those kind of schools, it's really hard to find other ways. And now TVB and Cantopop and these forms have been there, and in some sense you could say that's been part of historically what's kept it going despite all these other factors against it. But in some sense I think your question is also about if this wasn't there too, as less and less movies are made in Cantonese and they're in Mandarin, as less and less singers who are the top idols and pop stars sing in Mandarin rather than Cantonese, what does that bode for Cantonese? And if you're asking about the leveraging of it, maybe the kind of default answer is unless there is a kind of industry that literally keeps on creating cool, hip Cantonese forms, it's really uncertain.
And the media, the type of media is also changing because before we had internet, we didn't have a lot of options for entertainment. So your parents rented some VCR drama series, then you have to watch it with your parents because that's the only entertainment you may have at home. But now we have the internet, there are a lot more options, and people can watch movies from another country. And entertainment from elsewhere, it's so accessible through the internet, so TVB drama series is not the only choice.
But someone still has to produce it. And again, I hope that is taken up tomorrow as people think about you still need production. Someone's got to make these things to distribute, even if we have internet and these things. So another hand, yeah. There's one back there and then one over on the left. Yeah. Can we pass the microphone over here?
I'm not trying to pass the buck. I noticed that in our audience there's the presence of Professor Wang from Simon Fraser University. Perhaps he would be kind enough to throw some lights on this subject, Cantonese language, culture. I think he's well qualified for that matter. Thank you.
Let's put Jan Walls on the spot. Please pass the microphone. He can't be fired when he was tenured, and now he can't be fired because he's no longer working. Yeah.
Personally, I started out learning Mandarin because that's all that was taught in university. But fortunately, I got interested in medieval Chinese poetry, and I found out that because there were a few Cantonese speakers in Bloomington, Indiana, where I was studying at Indiana University, and I noticed that when they chanted Tang poems, they really sounded beautiful, and they all rhymed. But if you do it in Mandarin, they don't. Very often they don't rhyme. Often they do, but very often they don't. So when I wrote when I worked on my PhD dissertation, which was on a late Tang Dynasty poetess, when I was analyzing the structure of the poems and so forth, I found, I would recognize repeated sounds and that sort of thing much more easily if I could read them in Cantonese. So I started learning pronunciation of Cantonese. Then in 1970, when I got my first job after my doctoral work teaching Mandarin here in the Asian Studies Department at UBC. We would go into Chinatown and to buy cha chao and other Chinese things, and I thought, oh, this is not fair. They understand everything we say because they've been to the Shaw Brothers Theater or to Java Theater, and they could understand our Mandarin, but they would talk back to us in Cantonese. So I was even more highly motivated to learn a bit of Cantonese then. But that's my personal experience. But I would say in general, when we're talking mostly about young people. I mean, if we're concerned about the future of a language or a dialect, we're looking primarily at the young people because they are the future. I think that first of all, you need to convince them why is Chinese important? Why should anybody learn Chinese? Why should anybody learn any dialect of Chinese? Well, it's because it's really the two lingua franca, I think, emerging around the world now are English and Chinese. I think if you have those two, but if you live in North America, especially, if you've got English, Chinese, and Spanish down, you've got everything. North and South America, North, Central, and South America. There's a huge economic motive there. To say, okay, so Chinese is important. I used to, when I did my duties in the Dean of Arts office as a faculty advisor for arts, once every couple of weeks, I think I did, people would come up to me and ask me, why should I major in Chinese or something? And I asked them, when you graduate, are you going to be looking for work or are you independently wealthy? And if they said, well, of course I'm going to be working. And I said, well, I suggest you, major in something really relevant that everybody's going to understand, but take every elective course that you can possibly take in Chinese, because if you can say, oh, well, yeah, I majored in business or I majored in economics or something, and by the way, I'm basically fluent in Chinese, you got a competitive edge on your CV when you apply for work afterwards. If they said I'm independently wealthy, I embrace them and welcome them to the world of medieval Chinese poetry. But that's a very small minority. Then the question, the second question, okay, Chinese, well, what should I learn? Should it be Mandarin or should it be Cantonese? And once again, my answer is I don't think it's an either-or question. It's a question of which one should you learn first. If your parents, your grandparents, your ancestors, or for whatever reason, or your neighbors or whatever, if they speak Cantonese, learn Cantonese first. Once you learn one, then you've got a big head start on learning the other, and it'll make it much easier to learn to learn the other. Chances are you'll probably have a bit of an accent when you learn the other, like 我講廣東話嘅時候啊，大家都話你國語嘅發音啊，國語嘅口音啊， you have a Mandarin accent, that sort of thing. But what the heck? It's much easier. In fact, having learned Chinese, if you want to say, suppose Japan becomes the big target, and learning Japanese becomes very, very easy for you because 70-75% of all the words used in Japanese, you recognize them as coming, from Chinese origin and so forth. There are all sorts of reasons, but it's not a question of either or. It's a question of which one you want to learn first. Just like, should I learn traditional Chinese characters or should I learn the simplified Chinese characters? Again, that's a false dichotomy. It's which one do you learn first? The other one will come much easier that way. Have I dealt with your question ad nauseum? Ad nauseum.
Before retirement and long before was taught many generations of people Chinese, and so I'm glad that you actually asked Jan or Professor Walls to stand out. There are many people in this room who I think have a lot to say about this subject, which is why again we wanted to have a lot of time to ask questions, make statements, and things like that. So others, some of the people who were laughing at the videos, I mean, again, this is in some sense about younger generations, so maybe we can hear from some of the people who are not yet 40. Anybody?
And I just want to add the part, I totally agree with you that it's not an either or question. Because whenever I say, oh, we need to speak Cantonese, then people would think, does it mean you hate Mandarin? No, it's not an either or question. Because linguistically, it's good to be multilingual. So the issue here is whether native speaker of Cantonese, when they have kids, do they want to change their mother tongue? Are they trying to change their kids' mother tongue, which is a totally different issue. So if we're talking about learning Cantonese or Mandarin as a second or third language, it is a different issue, and I would encourage everyone to learn more languages. So it is really not an either or question. And I'd also like to advertise the Cantonese Studies program of UBC that will start in September. So if you're a UBC student, you may consider enrolling.
And in fact, the way it's built right now is you have to have a base in fact, Mandarin to take that. Yes.
One thing.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
One of the things that has been mentioned a couple of times is the question of identity. And I know that's meaningful to a lot of people, and especially to young people, because they're forming an identity that they're going to probably carry into adulthood and old age.
They're 40.
Oh, wow. Give me another 5 years, I would have been there twice. But I've been arguing, well, for 40 years now, I think, that learning Chinese, or in fact learning Japanese, learning Russian, whatever, does not make you somehow a watered down, less than fully Canadian person. It makes you a better Canadian. It makes you a more competitive Canadian, if you like, if you're into competition. But it makes you actually a brighter Canadian, because someone mentioned earlier there are so many beautiful metaphorical expressions, 4-character expressions in Chinese. What you're doing is you're using the right hemisphere of your brain, which is the relational thing. You're using that much more than you would probably in speaking everyday English. So you, as long as you have internalized Canadian values, okay, then it makes you a Canadian, not a watered down Canadian, because you become more competent in today's sort of global village or globalizing environment. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. I think that's a pretty important point, though.
I think Professor Fullerton? Yeah. Thanks, Jan.
You mentioned Malaysia as being a place where Cantonese is in a very stable kind of situation, and I'm wondering why. So what's different about the circumstances in Malaysia?
Yeah, Malaysia is a very interesting place. Because if you know someone who's Malaysian, you find they are super multilingual. They speak Malay, English, Hokkien, Cantonese, Hakka. And that's because, first, Malaysia is away from the political forces in China or Hong Kong. So they have that advantage to conserve the language. And another thing is they are very used to being multilingual. They're used to speaking multiple languages. So they don't have this idea that the official language is better than others. So even though Malay is the official language, people wouldn't think that it is uncivilized to speak other languages. So Malaysia can definitely conserve the language better than other overseas communities in that sense.
And from a historical perspective, you could say that it's still very colonial, or has structurally is more similar to that earlier world before the end of empires. Most imperial states tolerated multilingualism, because that's one of the ways in which subject peoples let them speak their language as long as they, politically are loyal to the empire. It's fine. It's why for a long time the Chinese Empire, didn't need to stamp out minority languages or regional variations in language and things like that. As long as you are loyal to the state, pay your taxes. If you think of Malay, different territories and kingdoms in Malaya, people spoke multiple languages. Vietnam was actually, or Indochina, same thing. Especially ethnic Chinese, ethnic Cantonese, and Hokkien traders. These were business languages. Each language had a network So if you could speak multiple language, the utility of being able to plug into networks was higher. There's a joke that if you were in a place like Vietnam, it's sort of like you meet someone, you sort of say, oh, what do you speak? And then you always pull out some relative. Oh, you're Cantonese, I'm also Cantonese. And then you say, my uncle, da 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 da. And then you meet someone else and it's like, oh, you're Chuzhou, I'm Chuzhou. And so it's, in terms of business and trade, the ability to code switch among many languages historically in these areas was really useful. And that's, in some sense, the way people grew up. Was they would learn multiple languages because they all had their utility. English was useful in a particular way. Malay was useful in a particular way. Hokkien as a language is useful. Even if you were from a family that was dominated as a home language speaking Hokkien, it was still useful to learn Cantonese. It was still useful to learn these others because often these trade languages were specific to certain industries as well. So the way that economic niches were filled by certain networks that overlapped with linguistic networks. So that's why for a long time it was like that. Why it still is like that is because the rise of Malay nationhood didn't actually stamp that out. That Malaysia now has, in some sense, all the different states of Malaysia have let that be, as long as everybody can speak enough Malay for there to be a Malay national language, but they haven't stamped out other languages as a matter of state policy, which is but historically it's a kind of the inertia from earlier ways in which languages were used in imperial and colonial societies. I don't know if that's a way to answer that. We have, over here. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm Jennifer Peng from the Development Office in the Faculty of Arts. When I was growing up in Canada, I used to go to a lot of Chinese restaurants, and almost exclusively, as I was a younger person, they would be Cantonese cuisine. But probably in the last 10 years, I've really noticed fewer and fewer Cantonese cuisine restaurants and more Northern Chinese cuisine restaurants. I would imagine that's partially because of more migration from northern China and meeting the demand of newcomers to Canada. But I also wonder, is it also a symbol of Chinese adaptiveness? Cantonese speakers now cooking northern Chinese cuisine, and that may be sort of related to the threat that the Cantonese culture might be facing in the future? Is there any kind of information about that? Thanks.
Zoe's a foodie, loves eating. I don't think I can answer your question, but I will say there's two, as Zoe keeps on thinking, because I'm sure she'll come up with something more interesting to say than this. But there's two kind of partial answers that I hear. One is the dominance of Cantonese cuisine. I would be careful with that because most of the people who opened Chinese restaurants in North America were farmers. They weren't cooking very well. That's why you have things like chop suey and sweet and sour pork and, that kind of electric lemon chicken sauce that looks like yellow in a way that can't be natural. So up until, I'd say, the 1970s, what was Chinese food in North America was generally a kind of for those who weren't Chinese who couldn't tell the difference, let's say, and you just chop it up and, stir fry it, there you go. And so there's great variations, and so cuisine is technically the right word to use, but it wasn't, in some sense, actually much to do with what was eaten in home villages. Now, those restaurants often, they could have given you also a home-cooked meal if you were from the same village, and there was things off menu where the people who actually worked in those restaurants, they would eat afterwards always, and that was probably a whole different cuisine, and that was probably much more related to rural village cuisine from the places that those migrants came from. That said, in the 70s, what happened was Hong Kong-style cuisine began to really go across the major areas where Hong Kong Chinese were coming. And so Hong Kong-style cafes, Hong Kong sort of high-end dim sum, and all these kinds of things. And so then you could say that Cantonese cuisine at that moment began to be a part of the Cantonese worlds of the new migrations from the 70s on. And that's where Vancouver suddenly went from having kind of, just to be honest, terrible Chinese food to actually quite good Cantonese style, Hong Kong style Cantonese cuisine. What I think you mentioned is the kind of now you're going around and you're hearing a lot more Mandarin spoken. That depends. Sometimes it's because you have people now coming from mainland China who are from Guangdong province, but they speak Mandarin because that is actually their first language. That's what they learn in school, and we have generations now who grew up in Guangdong who actually speak Mandarin more naturally because that's their home and school language. So that's partly. The other is there's large-scale migrations. In fact, new migrations to Canada, not so much to the United States, but to Canada, are dominated by people from other parts of mainland China now. In fact, there are very few in terms of proportion who are Hong Kong Chinese, for instance, compared to the larger mass. And so, again, you're seeing in small businesses, particularly restaurants, people from all around different parts of China who are serving different kinds of cuisine, not just because they're customer based, but because that is, again, something that's tied to their home origins in China. I'd also, your other final point about adaptiveness, and that goes to the sort of, chop suey and these things that are, foods you never find in China. The centuries of Cantonese, I'll put it, just throw it out right here, and I have no proof, but I'm going to throw it out. Cantonese, in some sense, invented the idea of ethnic cuisine all around the world, because what they invented was small family-run restaurants that could be replicated as modular anywhere. Everywhere from South Africa to the Arctic Circle in Norway to Madagascar so Chuck Kwan, the great filmmaker in Toronto, has this series that took him 10 years to make where he just went around the world going to different Chinese restaurants around the world. And, Chinese restaurants in India serve different food than the Chinese restaurants in Madagascar serve different food than Chinese restaurants in Chicago. Different, and that's part of that adaptability of, it's not about the cuisine, it's about making something that people will buy so that you can be like John Lee Lum, the guy I showed, to make enough money that you're going to have enough wealth that you're going to return home the big man of the village. And so restaurants were a tool. By the mid-20th century, in most of the places that the Cantonese were going, they were exploiting their children as part of this tool, right? So if you're a daughter or son of one of these restaurants, you're free labor. So it's a highly efficient kind of business model that wherever you go, you can have, your family work in there and things like that. So in order to understand that kind of adaptability and why it is that a lot of the foods there are just nominally Chinese, it's because it's about what will sell. And so if you're in Minnesota, you'll get deep-fried wonton cream cheese. Something that's in the Midwest is Chinese food. You go to a Chinese restaurant in the Midwest, that's one of the things that you can order. Everybody assumes it's Chinese food, but like many of the kind of overseas Chinese restaurant cuisine, it has nothing to do sometimes with what's eaten in China. And that's, again, one of the interesting aspects of these migration networks, is that there is proliferation of different foods. Again, in Japan, to use an example that is quite common, we know that ramen is Japanese, national dish. Anybody who's Japanese will say this is the thing that defines us. Well, it began in Japan as a Chinese dish. It comes from ramen, it's cold noodles. And so there's ways in which the Chinese who went and opened restaurants all around the world adapted whatever they could sell, to the local environment. So I think that's another aspect of your question. So I don't think I answered any of your questions, but hopefully those are some answers.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this is relevant to your question, but I think this Cantonese versus Mandarin thing, actually they're not enemies, but people think about it that way. In Canada, I wouldn't think it would be a problem if we have more northern cuisines, because we just have more diversity, and the growing number of restaurants is just reflecting the market trend. So I wouldn't see that as a cultural threat. But in Hong Kong, the issue would be different, because Canada is kind of neutral when it comes to Cantonese versus Mandarin, but in Hong Kong, earlier there was this debate about Chongqing gai bo, which is hot pot, chicken hot pot. It's getting more popular in Hong Kong, and then there were some young people who wrote on the internet saying we should boycott Chongqing chicken hot pot because, as you may know, a lot of small restaurants, local restaurants in Hong Kong closed down because of the rocketing rents. Like all the wonton noodle shop, they closed down. And ironically, a lot of Chongqing chicken hot pot restaurants just pop up out of nowhere. So these young people say, we should not go to those Chongqing restaurants. We should go to the wonton noodle, save our local businesses, something like that. So these young people put a lot of emotion into this issue and they bring it to the political level. So it does happen in Hong Kong.
Sorry, someone should be marking the people putting up their hands, so I'm going to...
I probably want to make a statement, but that may become a question. So when we talk about senior home services, and we realize is when you get old, you will switch back to your mother tongue too. So in success, that's why we emphasize on the service on Cantonese, and also the Chinese food. So regardless how fluent English you speak, when you get old, you lost the learned language. You switch back to your mother tongue. So in your research, you focus on young people. So would you also look into the area on the senior, on the Cantonese? Yeah.
Actually, there's this video. They give pretty positive comments about the food. So I think this is counterintuitive because we would expect that older people have higher standards because they've been eating Chinese food for their whole life. But interestingly, the young people consciously want to give us the message that I am an expert about Chinese food. This is all unauthentic. I cannot eat that. Yeah. So I encourage you to Google that video. Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah.
We have a, yep, check your shirt, yeah. And then someone over here. Okay.
My name is Yunshan Wan Hin from undergrad sociology. I'm doing my 3rd year, going to 4th year. I have a few comments / questions. So the first thing is I don't have linguistic background, but when we are talking about preserve, I feel like language is always like fluid. It's like the change is ongoing, and also there's a tendency that stronger dialects always absorb weaker dialects. So, for example, Hakka before has a pretty visible population in Guangzhou too, but by generation, like me myself will be a bad example to preserve Hakka, and that kind of generally washed away from the population. And also it's the tendency that we use the language and the usage will determine how it goes. So similarly, Hong Kong Cantonese has a higher proportion of English influenced words than traditional ones in other Canton region. So that brings up a question that when we're talking about preserving Cantonese, what is to preserve? Like, because when it moves on, I'll give one example. I'm not expert on it, but like 长沙话, 长沙话, there is like kind of recent development that called plastic Mandarin, 塑料普通话. And that is essentially a 长沙 or Xiang toned Mandarin, and it has the tone of the Changsha dialect, but it is not 长沙话. So it's I can see like the future of Cantonese, although we are not on the stage, but it might be moving into that direction. And people have perfect, like the schools when they are teaching Mandarin, everyone speaks plastic Mandarin, and they feel that this is the way of like being local, but it's very far from their actual kind of authentic Changsha dialect. And the second one is we often talk about like the political factors in terms of making the language like an official status or so. But I would also like to point out that it's not the only factor, and in fact it won't direct to any solution by just challenging the political factors. For example, in China, there's a huge scale of inner migration, and migrant workers in the cities, how do you communicate with them? Like they speak a mutually unintelligible dialect, but the business has to go on. So somehow we will have to find a way to speak something that we can both understand. And perhaps in Canada, that's okay because we speak sort of English, either like Indian tone English or Canto tone English. It's still English, but imagine someone speak Welsh or Scottish. Like sooner or later, that dialect would disappear because somehow you have to speak something that we all understand. Also, it's on the identity issue. So you mentioned the example of Chongqing Gaibo. Like, but also often I found like identity is self-constructed, and it's like a labeling. So when Hong Kong, sometimes we label like mainlanders. We in Canton, like in Guangzhou, we label Hong Kong people when we disagree something on political terms, like 反水客 something. And then we will label them in Cantonese with Cantonese labels, that proving that you are not authentic Cantonese or something. And that language itself is used as a weapon or a label for political ends. And although like when we study them, like we must know that that's a label, like that's not the essence of the problem. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. So I'll talk about the first issue first. So what are we actually preserving? So evolution is different from endangerment. So if the language evolves, that's fine, and linguists are not trying to stop evolution. So logically, it's possible that languages become a mixed version, a mixed variety of language. They become a hybrid language, which is called a Creole technically. That is a logical possibility. Then it just evolves, and that's fine. So endangerment is a different issue because that means no new speakers are speaking any variety of that language. Yeah. So evolution and endangerment are two different issues. And for another question about lingua franca, yes, we need a common language to communicate with different people with different backgrounds. But having a lingua franca doesn't necessarily lead to the extinction of local languages. For example, if we look at the case of India, there are a lot of local regional languages, and people communicate with each other in English. And those local languages are fine. They are safe. People are still speaking it. So having a common language with people, everyone in the country, and speaking a local language at home, they can coexist. So the case for Cantonese is for political forces, we can see banners like "Be civilized, speak Putonghua" in China. So that discourages young people to speak the language because they would relate speaking regional languages to improper, informal, or only poor people speak regional languages. So this is a different case. Yeah. So, yeah. More.
Some of like some. Anyway, Jack and then Tony and then.
Thank you. I also want to thank all the organizers for organizing this amazing conference, especially for someone coming from Toronto. So to learn about all the very interesting ideas and insights on Cantonese, and I really appreciate the debate. And so I just want to raise a few observations that I have, especially from Toronto, and also I moved to Canada just about 13 years ago, so still some perspective from Hong Kong maybe. And so I want to add some observation that is more towards the positive note about Cantonese as a a language in the future. Because, like for example, in Toronto, we see that there's still a lot of people speaking Cantonese. From my observation and also from some of the data that I have in the Richard Charles Lee Canada Hong Kong Library that I manage. So there's still predominantly more Cantonese speaker in some of the data that we survey up until 2011. And the other thing is, in Toronto, we had a lot of community activities that are primarily conducted in Cantonese. There's some youth organization, senior cares, Yi Hong and Mang Shan. So they actually provide service mainly in Cantonese. And recently, the Hong Kong ETO, the Economic and Trade Office, sponsored a Cantonese song writing competition. So that kind of keeping the language going. So that actually also brings back some of my observations when I was still in Hong Kong. So Cantonese, I think, is still the official language, one of the official languages, spoken languages, I mean. So it was used in the government, in the legislative council, and in schools. Actually, after 1997, there are more schools who use Cantonese to teach different subjects, because before 1997, actually most of the schools came themselves as English school, and so they use English textbook. But in fact, many of the teachers actually use Cantonese to teach anyway. But after 1997, because like the chief executive, Mr. Dong, so he done a lot of crazy things. But one of the good things he done is actually promoting Cantonese to be used in the school. So that's one positive thing. So I guess that's also one of the factors why there are so many young people. They are so concerned about the Cantonese culture and the Cantonese in Hong Kong, like looking at the umbrella movement. And so I think there's a lot of positive factors. And about people in Guangdong, so I don't know, you mentioned that a lot of people that you talk to in Vancouver, their family, even though they are living in Canton, but they actually may just speak Mandarin as their home language. I might tend to disagree, because it's true that it's the same as like Jane Wall mentioned, it's either or. So I think the kids or the native people from Guangdong, I think their families still speak Cantonese to them at home. But it's true that at school, they will learn Mandarin, and they will speak in Mandarin mainly to communicate, because the government want to promote a common language in the country so that 1.3 billion people can communicate with each other. But in Guangdong, I think the Cantonese culture or language is still very strong. I think that phenomenon might be confused by a lot of migrants, because like one of the person asked question, they raised a very good point. The migration phenomenon in China is also affecting our understanding of the language a lot, because a lot of those people who came themselves coming from Hong Kong, Guangdong, or Shenzhen, or those cities, actually their parents may be actually from northern China, and then they think themselves coming from Guangdong, and they said that, oh, actually at home I speak Mandarin. So that might be the situation. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, in some sense, we have to be careful not to nativize people who trace their roots back to the Tang Dynasty migrations from the north. So there's, in fact, if you look at Guangzhou, which, you know, in terms of internal migration, the number of people who move in China as internal migrants is greater than the number of people who move between countries for the rest of the globe combined. So I'll just repeat that. More people move internally in China each year than the whole rest of the world, migrants crossing borders combined. So in that sense, and so what I meant was that people coming from Guangdong, whose home language is Mandarin, they identify as being, you know, from Guangdong province, because many of them are either second-generation migrants internally, children of people who had moved and things like that. But so it's not a chauvinism about you have to be, you know, descended from people who moved 800 years ago in order to be really Cantonese. It's that the definition of being from Guangdong has changed because of the internal migrations as well, if that makes sense. Yeah. Tony.
Of Henry's and also UBC staff at Faculty of Science. My question is probably particularly targeted to Zoe or the younger generation, but Henry's free to chime in as well. Brilliant presentation. Recently, my question is, recently we've seen a trend of intervention by the mainland government into Cantonese-speaking areas such as Guangdong, where the Chinese media is not allowed to use Cantonese as their main programming language, but rather Mandarin as their primary language. And we've also seen a recent interjection of mainland education into the Hong Kong curriculum and their promotion of Mandarin in Hong Kong itself. And fortunately for me, when I grew up, I learned 3 languages at the same time. So the issue of Cantonese Mandarin identity never crossed my mind. But recently, if you visited Hong Kong, especially Hong Kong expatriates, you'll see that people often speak in a mixture of Cantonese and English because of their foreign background, because they were educated, their parents educated them in Great Britain or in Canada or in the States. But do you think in the next 50 years to 100 years, do you think if there will be a mixture of, say, Cantonese and Mandarin because of how the mainland government is trying to intervene in how kids are being taught up in Hong Kong?
Okay. Thank you for the question. Actually, this phenomenon is called code mixing, like putting words from different languages in one single sentence called code mixing, and that's already happening in Hong Kong. And I have some videos. So the first video, it's about Guangzhou, and it's from a documentary, and this man tried to speak Cantonese to the kids in Guangzhou, but they didn't respond in Cantonese, or they didn't understand. They ignored him, basically. And they responded in Mandarin. So that's one case. And also we find cases where students are punished for speaking Cantonese in school. And that's very bad because it's going to give traumatic experience for the kids. And for the situation in Hong Kong, actually, there are more and more schools using Mandarin as the medium of instruction. And in this documentary, the linguistic test in schools, they ask the kids, do you know the meaning of 水皮 or 炸低 or colloquial Cantonese words like that, and the kids don't understand those terms anymore. And this is Mr. Lau, and he was trying to find a kindergarten that uses Cantonese as the medium of instruction, and he had a hard time finding this kindergarten for his daughter because it doesn't work. But yeah. Okay, we can skip that. But this is a common situation in Hong Kong, and there's another study. So 72% of primary schools in Hong Kong use Mandarin as the medium of instruction in Chinese language classes. And there's a study in Hong Kong University. So it's an MA thesis. So the student looked at language used in the playground in Hong Kong. And the student found that children taught Chinese language in Putonghua were beginning to use Mandarin in the playground with their friends. So we can see trends like this in Hong Kong right now. So it may be possible that they will co-mix. When they are unable to find a in Cantonese, they switch to Mandarin. This is a possibility.
So we have about 5 more minutes left. I have 2 more questions. One in the front here, and then one behind. Yeah, let's go ahead, and then one there, and we'll see if we can squeeze in another after that. But yeah.
Hi, I'm Jane, and I'm currently in Henry's class. And I just sort of want to understand better, like, what the relationship is between Mandarinization and Anglicization, and like sort of those two languages were named as like the dominant things, and I kind of want to understand better how like those things relate to each other. Tony talked about like the mixing of Cantonese and English, and how English is already a like colonial language, and how that's a dominant thing in so many people's lives. And yeah, I just also want to sort of understand better like the accounting for the why there is a need for Mandarinization, and like sort of the longer history of Mandarinization, yeah, and its relation to Anglicization. I don't know if that's clear.
For Mandarinization, I cannot speak for the government, but it started from about 2002 and 2008. There was a curriculum document stating that using Mandarin as the medium of instruction in Chinese language classes is the long-term goal of the Education Bureau. And the government put a lot of money in this project. But among the field of linguists, we don't actually have evidence showing that it can improve the people's language proficiency in Chinese if they use Mandarin as the medium of instruction in Chinese language classes. So it's still very controversial.
And I'd say, while she's searching for the slide, I'd also say that it depends on where you're talking. When you say Mandarinization is sort of like a gentrification. It's one of these terms that generally is, has a connotation of being bad. But the adoption, again, of Mandarin in Malaysia, just to give that example again, it was picked up really in the last 30 or so years as an extra language. So it's one more language that lots of kids growing up in parts of Malaysia can speak. So there's not the same connotation that this is somehow displacing or at the odds of other languages. And so it depends on where. I think in a place like Hong Kong, that's a particular way, a term with a lot of political weight. In Singapore, it had a lot of political weight because it was explicitly a policy to displace the other dialects, so to speak. And so it depends on where and how that term, whether in English or other equivalents, what's the political valence of it. Again, why you keep on bringing up the Malaysia context is just here's a context where it's not as politically loaded in terms of displacement, that the either or that Professor Walls brought up is not as strongly pushed.
Yeah. And for Anglicization, learning English or Mandarin as a separate subject is different from using Mandarin as the medium of instruction in Chinese language classes, because Chinese language classes are basically your mother tongue class. So it's a tool for you to think. So it's okay to learn Mandarin as a separate subject. So Anglicization is more like that. It's a separate subject. So English is a separate subject. We didn't use English to learn Chinese poetry. So that's a difference. So the influence of using Mandarin as the medium of instruction is that it changes the tool for thinking about more abstract things. And if we look at this news cut from Singtao Daily, it says Putonghua may be used as the medium of instruction for all subjects in Hong Kong schools in the long run. So they found that kids are memorizing the multiplication table in Mandarin. So that's what I mean by a thinking tool. So learning English as a separate subject is different in that case.
So one more question. I had someone right over here, and then if people want to actually keep talking and things like that, okay. So you'll be the last. But there was one over here. Just no, nobody. Okay, you are the last then, in the back. Yeah.
Yes, if I may, I would prefer to speak in Cantonese because of my broken English.
Sure.
Or French. 對唔住啊，我特登即係今日。喺度想補充啲，你哋已經 cover 得好好，講啲嘢好實際，好有益。咁啊，我本人咧就講好幾種話嘅，但係幾種話咧並不表示我好叻，而係用嗰幾種話去全世界邊度都行得通嘅，所以可以還咧講 Cantonese 好，講英文好。你以為英文係咁好嘢啊？你試下南美啊講英文啦。唔係個個識㗎，講西班牙差唔多，去布拉斯話唔同。咁呢啲講多餘嘅，即係等大家明。我好中意旅行， 我嘅痛苦經驗啊，講咧 in terms of language， 我就睇到晒㗎啦。咁你講翻嘅旅行經驗咧，最近1年嚟咧，我特登去古巴，而家嚟緊啦，古巴熱啊，因為美國佬投資啊嘛，冇 sanction 啊嘛預備。咁啊，如果你哋想 promote Cantonese， 古巴係一個好地方，雖然遠一啲，同埋冇乜中國人啊。其實有個時期啊，中國人有成30萬啊。我同我個老婆仔啊，去到嘅時候揾唔到個唐人啊。哎呀，睇翻佢歷史啊，幾威水啊！又唱粵劇啦喎，又跳舞啦喎。中國嘅表現啊，好偉大啊！啊喺呢度唔好誤會咗，我係講政黨啊，我唔係講政治。咁點解去到我哋一個都冇？有，我跟佢一路去揾個招牌，有個 board 好大㗎，我諗7尺乘8尺，喺個 address 度揾唔到 office， 乜都冇啊！咁呢個反映出咩？頭先有一位都講過，即係時移亦也，即係變啦啲嘢。你諗下，如果我冇講出嚟，唔係3萬啊，30萬。最有趣嘅地方，我咁樣聽起上嚟好似所謂吹牛啊！西人都同我講過，喂，你哋唐人威水啊！唐人並不表示話係廣府人啊、廣東人或者北京人，而係話有條水啊 ，when there's a stream you find Chinese. How they could survive so nicely? Of course, painfully too. 所以呢，呢啲咁嘅嘢呢，我希望你哋年輕一代多啲去旅行，就唔係淨係喺度搞 academic 咁簡單嘅事㗎啦。喺呢度點解我要講足廣東話呢？ I don't feel like at home if I'm not speaking in Cantonese. You are promoting Cantonese language, right? I don't even think of a language as a dialect. 我今年嗰時候嚟80歲㗎啦。即係嗰頭近啊，正所謂，即係所睇到嘅嘢呢，經歷過你哋嘅年紀啦，咁啊呢度呢，有個老資格嘅人，可惜 retire 咗 from Victoria University，Dr. Lai， 佢 may be in a better position like Dr. Wang 嚟講一講，等大家有寬闊啲，好過我嚟喺度亂咁噏。事實上呢，睇到晒好 political 啲。講翻呢，有可惜今日呢，我唔見你哋 touch on the question of 普通話，點解會走出普通話嚟咧？唔係國語，唔係什麼中文，係咁多啦。Thank you。
唔該晒。Thank you for well. Zoe, you have anything to wrap up? I hope we see you all tomorrow, or as many of you as possible. Please join me in thanking Zoe.
Thank you for coming.